Welcome to Flex Perspectives, where I interview the thought leaders, innovators, and executives shaping the future of flexible work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by the Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 6,000 companies, 30,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Hunter Walk. Hunter is the co-founder and partner at HomeBrew, an early-stage venture capital firm. Hunter is one of the best in the business and has backed some incredible technology companies over the years. Today, we'll discuss the role location plays for early-stage technology teams. We'll talk about whether Hunter thinks it's important for early-stage startups to collaborate in person, whether a startup's office policy impacts his desire to invest, and where he sees flexibility trending in tech. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. That helps new listeners find the podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Flex Perspectives podcast. I'm Rob Sadow, CEO and co-founder at Scoop. Today, we have Hunter Walk on the podcast. Hunter is co-founder and partner of HomeBrew Venture Capital, where he invests in early-stage companies. HomeBrew has backed companies such as Plaid, Chime, and Gusto. Prior to HomeBrew, Hunter led consumer product management at YouTube and was part of the founding team at Linden Lab. Hunter, welcome.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me on. Those always sound a little bit like eulogies, but I'm glad that it's I'm still alive here.
Well, it's funny, Hunter, because you and I have known each other now. I think we met for the first time in 2014, so it's crazy to me that it's coming up on 10 years. You and I have a pretty hilarious story of the first time we met. I think it was probably, of the hundreds of venture capital meetings I've done, it's probably the most memorable one I've ever had. Do you remember that in that particular situation?
Yes, I love it. So I believe we got introduced via our mutual friend, Russ Fraden, who I absolutely loves, just a wonderful guy. And so he sung, the praises of what you were building. And so we had you in, and I guess this was when, people still met in offices and stuff like that. And so we got together, and you and your co-founder took me through, sort of what you were building, your backgrounds, why. And it was all very interesting. But I remember there was like one thing missing. Usually co-founders, sort of will lead or at least finish with a little bit of, sort of how they know each other, how they met, like why they're working together. And you hadn't supplied that. And so I remember, before we sort of got into, hey, do you have any questions for me? Here's what our process looks like. Saying, well, how do you guys know each other? And there was sort of a pause. And then you said, well, and you pointed to your co-founder, said, well, I've known him his whole life. And I said, oh, that must be a really interesting story. And then there was another pause, and you said, you don't realize we're brothers, do you? And no, I didn't know you two were brothers. I focus on first names. I don't really look at last names until especially when I've met somebody for the first time, until I am able to grip on to something and remember them for that. I'm kind of name blind, face blind. And so I said, okay, this is going to be a story that both of us retell, hopefully lovingly. And so I'm glad we're retelling it together lovingly. And like you said, almost 10 years later.
It's pretty unbelievable. It's very funny, Hunter. I think that changed the way that John and I pitched forever afterward. I think it was always, this is my co-founder and my brother, that always came through after that. So I appreciate that moment in teaching us the way that we have to kind of describe ourselves, even when we think it's semi-obvious. I would love to hear a little bit more about how you even got into early stage venture in the first place. What made you passionate about this topic and something you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, to be honest, it wasn't intentional in the sense of I never had put on my career path, become a VC. It was much more, ultimately all these things are always about people. And so this one was much more about when my co-founder at HomeBrew, Satya Patel, and I got back together. We had worked for about 3-4 years together at Google, 03 to 07. And then after he left to go back into venture, he had gone back and forth. And we had, stayed in touch personally, but also professionally. There's sometimes people who you sort of say at some point it'd be nice to find our way back together. Maybe we're on the same team, maybe whatever. And then there's sometimes folks you're just we're going to do something. So Satya and I wanted to do something. But we needed a blank sheet of paper moment versus, I'm sure you've had people try to convince you to come join something, and you're well, I don't know. I'd really like to figure out what's right for me. So he tried to come. He's oh, come start a company, will back you when he was at Battery. Or he joined Twitter. He was running product at Twitter. And while I was running product YouTube, and he's like, oh, you should come over here. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean come over there? Like, if I came over there, it would be to take your job. And he's like, no. Like, you know what we should do? Like, help with product strategy. And I'm like, help with product strategy? You mean the guy that like comes in meetings and suggests like, what should happen and then walks out without any responsibility? I'm like, everyone hates that guy. Like, why would I want to be that guy? But, he left Twitter.
Sounds like my life as a consultant, by the way, before
Exactly. Well, then you get paid. You just leave a binder behind and you're like, if it fails, they screwed up the implementation of my wonderful ideas. So he left Twitter. This was like middle of 2011. He had been running product Twitter, left there. I had stopped running product at YouTube, but still been at YouTube doing some stuff that I wanted to finish up, and sort of decided that it was time for me to leave Google. So we had that blank sheet of paper moment. He and I got back together. I mean, we'd spent time, but like got together in a directed way. And to fast forward through that, where we ended up was HomeBrew. And the reason we ended up with HomeBrew, our early stage venture fund, was because we decided that we were making a 20-year decision, not a 2-year decision. It was like, what do you want to do for the rest of our careers together? We decided we were more interested in other people's ideas than our own. I guess we'd spent, he'd gone back and forth between venture, but I guess like primarily when you think of product management, you think of kind of working on your own ideas or the ideas of your team. And we wanted to work on other people's ideas. And the reason we wanted to work on other people's ideas was because so much had changed. I'm going to be 50 this year. So when I got into tech, when I got out to the Valley, it was sort of the late 90s. And, software was only doing so much. Like, it was always magical, but it was only transforming so many consumers' lives and so many, a limited number of businesses. And now, Mark Andreessen, software eats the world. I say software enables the world. It's a little less predatory, but, it meant that founders could build software that could, not just 1% of consumers, but 100% of consumers, not just the US, but the world, not just tech building for tech companies, but construction, agriculture, healthcare, industries that predate the PC. And wouldn't the world be a better place if the founders building those companies, if we could like some number of them, maybe just increase like the velocity and probability of their success slightly? I mean, that's all I think about in the best case scenario we do, or sort of like a force multiplier that hopefully is privileged enough to work with and be on behalf of founders who are building things that matter to them. And if they have chosen, valuable problems to solve and are the types of founders who want to solve them, to the fullest extent they can, like what they build will be valuable. And so that's what we do. We make about 10 to 12 investments a year. So we try to really sort of stay small and focused. For the first 9 years of HomeBrew, we used other people's money, endowments, foundations, that type of stuff. But at the beginning of last year, I guess 2022, switched to a largely personal capital model, at least for now. So really our skin in the game. The way I sort of talk about it is, we have sort of the alignment of angel investors, right? So like the type, I'm sure you have people on your cap table who are like, they just, they're there for you, right? Like, obviously you're in business together, but like they're there for you. And so we have the alignment of an angel investor. It's our money. It's what we do, but sort of the gravitas, the experience, and the, network of an institutional investor, a larger VC. And so we think that's a nice value proposition for founders. And, and it's the way that we go about our day. So that's how we got into it. It was much more about a relationship, about the idea that there's wonderful people building, companies of, high interest, high value. And that if we could just help them a little bit, that, we could make the second half of our career out of that versus, sort of building our own products.
I love that story. And I love the long-term arc and 20-year perspective. It's a hard thing to commit to, right? In terms of how do you think about that much time and how to spend your career over that time. But to build incredible things requires a little bit of patience and long-term thinking.
I couldn't have, I'm glad I started. I loved being a product manager. I loved that part of my career. I was sort of felt like I was ready to move from the doing to the helping side, largely because I don't love being managed and I don't love managing. And like, people. And that was, that's sort of part of being, parts of teams or organizations. I'd much rather be a coach, a mentor, a helper, a roadie to the rock stars. And so for me, I was probably thinking about something that was going to be either more like polymath, like I could do a bunch of different stuff, or, a little less kind of org structure. But I don't think I would have gone into venture per se if it wasn't for Satya.
Yeah. Having the right person, the right co-founder who you've known your entire life, for example, is a pretty valuable thing, right?
It is, look, the greatest privilege in the world is to be able to sort of work with people you enjoy working with, who make you better, who like don't just like tolerate who you are, the weird parts, but like they want the full you and they want to help you be the best version of you. It's such a joy. So I'm very fortunate. Our families are friends, our wives are friends. Like the biggest sort of disappointment, I'd say, over the last decade is we actually spend less time together as families and couples because he and I see each other all the time for work. And so we don't get the families together as much. And, so I think maybe our goal for the rest of this year or next year is to spend more time together as families, not just as co-founders.
I totally understand that. It took John and I a long time before we figured out how to, at least 5 years, I would say, before we could have dinner or spend a weekend with family and Scoop just wouldn't come up, right?
Yeah.
Just be like, okay, we're just not going to talk about this stuff right now. Whatever's at work, we can leave that elsewhere and just have personal relationships. It's a little bit bipolar almost in terms of the way that you have to think about it, or kind of split your brain in terms of the relationship and allowing both sides of that to flourish.
Yeah, I could not. I admire that because I don't think I'd be capable of doing that with a family member.
It took a lot of practice. It took a lot of time to figure it out, and we still work on it every day and try to get better. I think Hunter, I imagine some folks that are listening probably very familiar with HomeBrew. A lot of folks may have never have heard of HomeBrew before. What are some of the companies that maybe people would have heard of that you've backed or been a part of their journey over time? And what are some of the ones that maybe folks haven't heard of yet that you're excited about that are on the come up?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we are so lucky but some of it is just people sometimes joke, how do you become a good venture investor? It's like get lucky early and then let the attribution, compound, So we were fortunate to, become involved in some pretty successful companies relatively early in HomeBrew's existence. We started late 2012, early 2013, and we're part of some of the earliest financings in companies such as Chime, which is sort of the largest, people call it a neobank, but it's really sort of, financial software that helps average consumers, sort of access their money and spend it in places. They have a debit card product, largest, sort of competitive bank to sort of the incumbents. So we're really proud of the work that we've done with them. In the opener, you sort of mentioned Gusto, amazing, sort of empowering SMB, SME, enterprise payroll and benefit solution. I sort of think about the types of like a great business model is like, what are the things that you have to do in order to run a business, but like don't need to become an expert in, like have zero competitive advantage if you run your payroll really well. And so, companies of all sizes just hand that over to Gusto and Gusto take care of it for them. More recently, or at least a little bit like sort of less name brand, but equally sizable, there's a company called Shield AI, that is essentially building the autonomous pilot for the public sector, starting with kind of the Department of Defense, government, that type of stuff. If there's a Netflix special out right now that they participated in called Killer Robots. It's obviously, sort of a little bit of a attention-getting title. They're not building killer robots. They're mostly focused on information and intelligence gathering that saves lives, not takes lives, but started by brothers, which was why it came to mind. One of whom was a Navy SEAL, came back from some deployments, thankfully safely, but came to his brother, who was an engineer, and said, I lost friends and we lost, sort of human beings, civilians, largely when we went into areas where the information was inaccurate, or went into areas that were unsafe in order to get information. Like, why can't we solve this with machinery as opposed to people? And they built Shield around that. Most recently in testing, their autonomous pilot flew an F-16, beat a human pilot. Wow. I'm really hopeful for what they can do in the future. You also asked a little bit about maybe up and comers or folks who are still earlier in their journey. Because I know our topic and I know what we're going to get into, I'm going to pick two that have chosen to be remote or distributed teams. One is Athena. They are started by two amazing female entrepreneurs. They're a software product for compliance training. Again, like what did I say? Another much like Gusto, right? Something that companies have to do, want to be good at, want to provide for their teams. But becoming an expert in doing it yourself is not part of a business model. So there's a company that will do it for you via software. So Athena, starting with things like sexual harassment training, so on and so forth, has a modern software product that's great. The founders are based much like you in the New York City, Brooklyn area. So you maybe have bumped into them on the streets and not even known it. But,
cool. Love it.
They've their clients include Snap, Zoom, a bunch of large companies, and a second one called Kettle. So Kettle is in the risk assessment business for fire, wind, like hurricane type of stuff. So they're a reinsurance company in the insurance business. They have basically building better data models that forecast risk for property damage when it comes to some of the major climate events, the storms of the century, fires of the century that seem to be happening more frequently than once
every 3 years
right
now.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a huge problem, not just from a human standpoint, but from, insurance is what we use to sort of backstop the disruption to our lives and businesses when these things could happen. And because the major insurance companies don't have risk models that are, modern, updated, and maybe as nuanced as they could be, they just sort of pull out of markets or overcharge premiums to everybody and things like that. And it's creating a real problem in California where I live. Some of the major insurers have stopped writing new homeowner policies, all these sorts of things. So when you think about, what are some of the quote unquote non-sexy things that have to happen in order for people just to be able to, live their lives in a dynamic, changing world, things like Kettle, I think are, tremendously important. And so all of these things, why did we get involved? I sort of joke that our decision-making is like a sandwich, people, problem, people. So, trying to evaluate the founders, is this the right business for them? Like, what's the founder market fit? Are they mission driven? Why are they doing this? And can we help them? Or are our expectations shared? Are we going to be able to create a great relationship? And then that middle part, the problem is just like, is the problem large? Is it urgent? Is it valuable? If you have two of those three, I think you have a sustainable business, and you have all three, you might have a venture scale. So somebody once told me, I didn't even realize that, they're like, oh, your thesis is love. I mean, like, what do you mean? They're like, LUV, large, urgent, valuable. I was like, oh, that's great.
I like that.
I'm going to steal that. Yeah. So I look for love problems, I guess, large, urgent, and valuable.
That's great. And such powerful missions across the different companies that you're talking about in very varied spaces. I think one of the most interesting things, and maybe even to segue into what you're already starting to talk about in terms of, remote work and the models in terms of how some of these companies operate, is you have very wide breadth and over a number of years now in terms of looking at different types of companies, different founding teams or structures, as well as how do you think about what industry they're participating in. And so one of the things I'm curious about, there have been some folks like, you had mentioned Mark Andreessen earlier and talking about software eating the world. Other folks like Elon Musk or Sam Altman have come out pretty strongly against some of the fully distributed or kind of fully remote work. What are you seeing right now in early stage? Are you seeing a particular like lean one way or the other in terms of model, fully remote, hybrid, and does it matter to you in terms of how companies are setting up?
Yeah. So it's interesting because obviously we went through a period of time during sort of peak pandemic, post-vaccination, where you didn't really have a choice if you were starting a company or you were sort of managing a company. You were all of a sudden, a remote or at least a hybrid company by necessity, if not by design. And that gave us a bunch of, sort of a taste of what this looked like. If we go back before that, of course, there were different types of hybrid situations. Not a lot of startups aren't built around, being in the office from 9 to 5, 5 days a week, you do, work gets done where work gets done. But all of a sudden we sort of had a bunch of, we accelerated development or tried a bunch of scenarios that before were only sort of, a little bit more anomalous. People were experimenting with, teams maybe overseas for supposedly cost or access to talent. You had companies like Automatic and so on and so forth in that moment who were like, evangelists for this, but by and large, there was a large gap, in between that, where most people, practiced as CEOs what they had experienced, as managers or individual contributors, which is you have an office, you go into it, and that's where work happens. I'd say we are seeing company, and we invest often when it's only the founders or the founders and a few people, so it's very small. And what I'd say is we've seen a deliberateness, and that's really what matters to me, right? So sometimes I'll get asked the question, "What do you think is best?" And I was like, "Well, let me tell you, a deliberate, consistent, well-applied version of any of these things is better than a, unintentional, inconsistent, misguided, attempt at any of these things, right? So give me founders who understand what they're getting into, who have chosen and realized that there's trade-offs in any of these models, and can articulate, how they are taking advantage of the pros, of any of these working styles, and how they're mitigating, some of the challenges. The anecdotal data to me suggests that, some sort of what I'd call hard hybrid as opposed to soft hybrid / in office is still preferred for a lot of venture-backed seed stage companies. That's to say, people are thinking about for the first 0 to 20 people, can we spend more time together than apart? And what I mean for that, and the difference between what I call sort of soft hybrid versus hard hybrid. Soft hybrid is kind of, well, we're in the office when we need to be in the office, and we'll sort of adjust what that means. And not everybody is, local. And so we don't all come into the offices the same day, but that type of stuff. Whereas hard hybrid is like, we're in office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, between this and that. Mondays and Fridays, you work from anywhere. We work generally in an Eastern time zone, blah, 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 blah. And I think the reasons that we see that, including, I think, all of our New York companies, all the companies in New York that started during the pandemic, are now in office after going through a period of sort of
in office 5 days a week, or in office in that kind of what you described as a hard hybrid.
3 to 5 days a week. And I think we can talk about why New York is an asterisk in general, a positive asterisk in a sense. I think it's for a few reasons. I think one, people practice. People are likely to use the muscles that they've trained before. And like I said, I think most people, if you are starting a company after 3 to 5 years of work experience, 10 to 12 years of work experience, you were trained on being in an office. The way you manage, it probably relies on some degree of management by walking around, one-on-ones together type of stuff. So I think it's just easier. There's a habit, right? And so sometimes you're like, well, that's how I know how to do it. I'm just going to continue doing it that way. I also think that there is, after a period of prolonged maybe separation, there's actually a little bit, not just amongst, sometimes I think people see this as very top down, like, well, it's a bad CEO who needs to, sort of manage by walking around, you should give your people as much leniency. Well, but I actually think, we're seeing in a lot of cases, team members, especially, again, New York is an asterisk, who want to not just work out of an apartment or a coffee shop, all day, like want to, in a way that respects, sort of a balance in their lives, so on and so forth, but like want to be with coworkers. And part of what they're signing up for at a seed stage startup often is, I want to meet people who are, like me, taking on the same types of risks. I want to feel like we're, pushing that boulder up the hill together, as opposed to working separately and combining. And then the third thing I think why is, and I am a believer in this, I think if you were going to tell me generally at the earliest stages of a company, without knowing anything else about the people you've assembled, do you think they're more likely to succeed if they are together frequently or together infrequently? And I think I bias towards they're more likely to succeed if they're together frequently, for speed of ideation, for trust and working relationship. That doesn't mean those things can't be formed in various hybrid or remote scenarios. And like I said, I'll take a deliberate, well-run version of any of those things over, bad management hybrid or bad management in office. But I am seeing a little bit more of a, return to form, let's say, at least around, what I'd call kind of hard hybrid, / in office.
So kind of more structured, few days a week in, where everybody's in at the same time type of model.
Yeah. And I think it's like, in a lot of these cases, because these companies are still small enough where they haven't had to question, yet whether to expand to multi-honed. They don't have international customer bases yet, so they haven't had to put people locally. They're sort of running, hybrid with people actually then deciding to sort of, come into the office sometimes other days, but more for working time, rather than meeting time, right? I think the best, ultimately, I think like Asana and other sort of actually project planning tools like should control or guide when we're together and when we're apart, because it really turns out that it's more about team and project phase as to whether being together or not is the most productive. And that's a very dynamic, sort of scenario. But because, everybody has lives too, and the choice of where you live and how you plan your schedule and how you take care of your kids and who walks your dog and, and when you're at your most alert and all that type of stuff is very individual, that we have to come up with sort of a one size fits all, guideline. I mean, I guess one would argue you don't have to, that you can sort of put that together more dynamically. But I actually think, we will grow more nuanced with this over time. As some of the tools we have are more fine-grained and maybe more data-driven than what we have today, which is basically like schedule planning and, red or green, like, talk to me or don't talk to me right now.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, one interesting thing that we find, and as you know, we have a lot of data on this stuff, right? Because of the Flex Index and capturing policies, is we find that still, even despite some of the things you're talking about in terms of early stage value in close co-location, being able to collaborate and ideate, and the speed at which that happens, I think north of like 80% of the firms that we track, I think at that size, are still either what you would describe as soft hybrid, right? So we call it employee's choice. Employee chooses whether, how often to go into the office, or as fully remote, meaning they have no offices at all and have started out fully remote. And one of the things I wonder, and I'm curious whether this even impacts the way you think about, do you invest or not, or how you advise companies on this, is a lot of times when I ask them, okay, well, how did you think about that relative to some of the benefits that you were describing in terms of co-location and collaboration? I hear a lot about cost structure, right? If I don't have to spend money on real estate, what does that mean in terms of how far my money can go? When do I reach break even? Can I invest that in talent or other things? The other thing I hear a lot is around just like access to talent, right? In terms of where I can hire, and can I only hire locally and access to that office, or can I hire more broadly? And maybe that has changed a little bit in the nature of tech layoffs and what's happened over the last year or two in terms of the talent market. But just curious, how are you hearing or seeing any of those things? And what are you talking to companies about when this stuff comes up?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I was going to say, actually, in some ways, I think those are the two worst reasons to do remote or soft hybrid, employee choice. And I guess let me say why. So I think any company that I work with that once had a rent line item and was like, well, now that we're a remote company or hybrid company, I'm going to zero that out. I'm like, no, like assume you're going to spend the same amount that you would on physical facilities, because what you're going to spend that on is making sure that everybody has the right equipment, work set up at home, that the software you might need to, and different types of software that helps manage different types of meetings you have, different types of cadence, different types of asynchronous work product. You might have your rent budget might move right to travel and offsites.
Totally.
When our team's going to get together. And so not to say that it's in actuality a cost neutral decision. For some, it might be. For some, they might save money. But I think doing it on the notion that it is dramatically cheaper just because you're not paying a landlord actually underserves your team and underserves the company. And so I sort of suggest to people that they think about it as cost neutral from that, because if you do sort of, if you zero it out, then you're less likely to approve, that boondoggle offsite or whatever, the offsite that sounds like a boondoggle. But if you just assume it's going to cost the same, you're not saving money, and you have to figure out how and when people should work together, what tools they need, what benefits packages look like when you are removing some of the things that you normally associate with being provided in office, and you want to provide that in a more distributed fashion. So
So
you
if I
might
were to
have
play
better
that back
data.
to you, Hunter,
Yeah.
just to make sure I understand. So in some ways, I think what I'm hearing you say is you would almost advise startups not to think about this as a quantitative or a financial decision, right? Like actually think about what's going to be best for you in terms of operating, collaboration, what you think is going to lead you to the best outcome
Assume it
success
is not
wise.
cheap. Assume it is not cheap.
Assume that there's no financial benefit to you one way or the other in terms of at least the way you pivot your thinking on this topic.
Yeah. On the talent side, so I obviously agree, like in the sense that, well, if you're telling me I'm trying to hire, a particular skill set and there's 1,000 of those people within a 20-mile radius of me, but 1,000,000 of them across the world, if I'm trying to hire one, don't I have a better shot at the 1,000,000 than the 1,000? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue that. But I guess what I'd say is that I feel like people throw that notion out there without sort of first kind of figuring out two things. My basic belief is that if you do not have a good hiring process, if you don't know how to hire talent, how to attract them, why somebody who has a good job, why a passive job seeker would like come to your startup, take a pay cut, that type of stuff. Just expanding the geographic aperture, will either produce no difference, you will still fail, or you'll have a moment of like more candidates, but you actually won't know how to spot and pick talent. And more so than ever, talented people, you're competing against more people than ever, too, more companies, than ever as well. And so your ability to attract quote unquote A+ talent, those skills need to be developed independent of your, office policies, and then again apply it based upon how you want to run your company. I've never seen a company that says we struggle to hire talent locally, but so we decided to not just look locally, look globally, and that solved all our other product, distribution, finance. Like, no, you probably have to figure out why isn't this resonating with talented people locally, and then once that's repeatable, like great, decide that global makes sense. Now, of course, sometimes if there's very specialized skill sets or people are like, look, we're trying to transform the chemical engineering industry. We have a company doing that. And there are clusters. We want to hire some people from industry, and there's clusters around these academic centers or clusters around these commercial centers. And we happen to be based in somewhere other than those, and we don't want to move there. I'd be like, yeah, that's probably right. The talent you want to reach, is disproportionately not local. And so it makes sense to think about how do you hire where people are. But just like the broad stroke of we suck at recruiting and can't convince great people to come to our company locally, so somehow, hiring across all the zip codes makes us a better company. It's like, no, it doesn't, So I guess I like a little bit of the Darwinism that sort of says like startups are hard. So, make sure you figure out how to become a great company and use your office policy in a way that's consistent with executing against that, rather than seeing sort of relaxing, some of the constraints as a salve for things that otherwise aren't working for you.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. One thing I'm curious about, maybe to kind of like talk about this in a couple of different ways. One, as you mentioned, you usually get involved in companies early, right? A couple of founders, and a few team members. How do you envision that scales out over time? Like, do you envision that set of companies is then going to only kind of like build in that one location, or is it going to distribute faster, you think, into different offices in different locations?
Yeah, no, I mean, I see it already. And I mean, I think, the question sort of leads to the answer, right? Which is obviously as companies get bigger, they end up for various reasons, not just staying within a single city or single office structure. They can grow organically. They can grow through acquisitions. They can grow about putting people where the customers are. I've seen all different configurations. Realistically, again, this is a generalization, but I think it's fair to discuss. As you build out, a manager rank, as you sort of expand your org, you get people with you get a larger number of people who are deeper into their careers. People who are deeper in their careers, it's fair to say statistically have more work experience, statistically are older, statistically have made other sets of choices about where they live, what their life looks like. And it's not like work hard, not work hard, that it's just, my New York companies, as an example, don't have a lot of people who live in Jersey with families yet, right? That's a talent pool that cuts across sales, marketing, engineering, management, all those sorts of things. And they will invariably want to hire those people. And so whether it's, California or the tri-state area, like you're going to have to figure out, well, as we go from 10 people to 50 people to 250 people, how do we flex, expand, think about the way we're working to make sure that we are not excluding folks from our hiring pipeline for reasons that don't benefit our company, right? We're not excluding based upon skill level, but geography, number of kids in school, commute, like that type of stuff. Like those are all bad reasons to exclude people. Now on the flip side, like, I have no problem with anybody, no matter what point in their career they are, deciding to prioritize aspects of their preferences or lifestyle over their work. That's totally cool. Like, so I don't, say like, well, if you're not willing to commute 90 minutes away each day, like, do you really care about work? It's like, no, that's bullshit. Like, who would want to do that? That sounds terrible. I understand why that person would want to work locally or remotely. But, at the same time, that comes with trade-offs as well, right? So if you want to optimize for where you live and optimize for a particular working, not working, sort of on-off calendar, like that's fine. The nice thing about the world we're in now is like you could find a good job, right? That meets your needs. It may or may not be at your current company, and that's okay too. Like as we came out of the pandemic, I told a bunch of our founders, like, hey, look, be deliberate about your decisions and realize that you are going to have, no matter what you decide, you will probably have a period of inflated, regretted attrition over the next 12 to 24 months as your employees decide what they want too. And that's fine.
There's other companies that you compete with decide also what
exactly.
their policy is going to be, and people sort themselves out.
It's just a great resort. The 5 to 10% of people who decided that they didn't want to be remote because they actually like coming into the office periodically, they like meeting their colleagues, and I have examples of those, they will move to companies that have decided to do hard hybrid, in office. And some of your employees who moved during the pandemic or had family situations that changed or just decided that they really enjoy working from their home or, a coffee shop down the block and don't want to, take the train into the city 5 days a week. Like those folks will find different jobs. Like that's totally cool. Like don't be afraid of that. I think sometimes leaders get afraid of making a decision, but it's this is like, it goes back to the open offices versus, office versus open space working decision. You survey engineers and you get 50-50, you know what I mean? So you can't survey your way to, I think, the right decision here. I think you have to just, you can be collaborative. You don't have to be addicted. You don't have to run a dictatorship without communication. That's probably a bad way to retain people, even those who agree with you. But I do
regardless
think
of policy.
Yeah, regardless of policy, on any policy. So I think that answers sort of most of your questions. I guess, I don't know, did I answer sort of like does this factor into our decision making on an investment? Is that like something
I was going to actually push on that. That's one thing I was curious, like, and maybe to make it a more pointed way, is there a company that you've either said yes to or said no to in terms of making an investment where this actually meaningfully influenced your internal thesis? Yes, let's do it, or no, let's not.
Yeah, I don't think so. There's companies where my concerns about whether we were the right fit for them have been confirmed by what I think is sort of like decisions that to me are just about being influenced by the last Hacker News post they read, or not understanding fully not understanding how to do a great remote, sort of company well, right? So folks have sort of said, yeah, we're doing remote and it's for these reasons. And, I said, well, how do you think about this complexity versus that, and I don't get particularly, well thought out answers or a curious mindset about it, or the reason they're doing it is just because somebody who they respect said, well, this is the way to do it, or that's the way to do it. And so both those extremes, I think, sort of suggest to me that maybe we're not the best fit for them. But I don't think there's been a decision where, oh, we love everything, but you're going to be in office 5 days a week, or we love everything, but I'm not sure remote is going to work for this style of company. What I have said in some cases is, I remember this one, I can't remember the company, but I do remember the discussion, and they wanted to do remote. And I wasn't sure if for this type of company and their type of style was going to make sense. And I said something to the extent of is this religion or strategy? If you find over the next 6 to 12 months that, this choice seems to be, potentially hindering success, is it something that you think about being flexible and experimenting with or changing? Or is it like a fundamental cultural attribute, and whether because they knew I wanted to hear, I'm sort of a leading question, right? But they said it's a strategy, right? We're not willing to succeed or fail based upon it. We think it gives us the best ability to succeed, and here's why. But here's what also we're thinking about during this first year, because we know we get a shot. Before we get too big, we get a shot at changing it. The bigger we get, the harder it is to change it. And I was like, that's fine. Even if I went in maybe being skeptical, I was perfectly willing to take that journey with them. And they've remained remote. Hey, they've remained remote. So who knows?
Yeah, totally. And look, I think the companies that have probably struggled, and this is not just a venture specific or a tech specific point, right? But I think the companies that have maybe struggled the most in follow through or alignment between executive and employee around model have been the ones that said, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do it forever. This is our point of view, regardless of data that comes in, how we operate, does it work or not work? This is it. And the ones that have said, hey, look, we're going to be a little bit more iterative. We're going to have discussion. We're going to see what works and doesn't work. We're going to evolve our policy. Maybe it looks different for us as a company when we're 50 people versus 100 people versus 500 people based on our needs. I think that humility in some ways in terms of approaching what obviously is still largely an unknown in terms of best practice or how to kind of operate through some of this model has served companies well.
I think the best case for saying this is a durable trend that's only going to increase in the future is we'll have more and more people who have managed and led and built companies or been part of teams that have tried on various versions of this, and they will undoubtedly have best practices, know what to do the next time around. You only need so many of those people to then help flip a company, right? It's not to be remote, you need 100% of the people having worked remote before. It's no, you need a small group of people across the organization who've done it before, and they can bring learnings and
who really knows what they're doing.
Plus, people will figure out how to use software tools and other types of aids, support infrastructure to, build collaboration, to build documentation, to build presence, so it won't all just fall on the people. Some of that intelligence will be built into software tools and templates. And the combination of those, seems like it would suggest that the success rate of, employee choice / remote, increases in the future. I'm not a person who believes anything's going to be 100% or 0%. But it would be tough to imagine it taking a step backwards, and easier to imagine taking steps forward.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And for what it's worth, I don't know if you and I have had this conversation before, but I do think that for that reason, whether companies do it as they start small or as they get larger, I do think they will tend to lean towards some model where in a somewhat organized way, people spend time in office part of the time out of office, and whether that's company decided, I tend to lean more toward teams starting to be able to decide that based on the needs and work practice, et cetera, of teams. I do think that's where we're headed. You raised a really interesting point around tools and software. And so from where you sit, do you think the technology in the near to the medium term, so let's call it the next 3 to 5 years, say, will get good enough to enable folks to be able to collaborate or ideate without co-location in that same way or at the same frequency? Or does that feel either too far off technologically or too inhuman, if you will, to actually be able to replace what it means to be able to sit side by side in an office at the early stage.
Yeah, I'm so biased here because I'm old enough to like, I spent my formative years, with teams, late nights, but, I buy into the sort of notion of bonding over, those in life, together experiences, that type of stuff. And so I tend to believe that you need some foundation and refreshing of that along the way. I don't know if you need it 100% of the time. Um, I guess I would say that I would always like teams and companies to care enough about performance and output that, you know, uh, if they feel like they're at a point in a project or at a point in a, in a heading towards a milestone, that like coming together feels right, that, you can do that. Right. And so whether that's the cadence of offsites, whether it's, like you said, team-based and project schedule, whether it's just like the, you know, we're getting stuck here. Like, what's the earliest we can all get together, and not turning that into, well, 6 months from now, there's a Tuesday on the calendar, let's pencil that in. But like, how do we experiment with coming together as a, not just for, ways of celebration, but for, ways of unsticking or accelerating. So I tend to believe that there is something like anthropological and sociological there, not just, lack of fidelity and tool set. But I'm 100% also willing to believe that, I am biased in that based upon age, um, personality type, experience set, and that people who grew up with those different circumstances and or are my same age, but have different sets of identity or lived experience, could articulate a perfectly good reason why they believe differently. But I still joke, like, I like the pheromones of being near Sacha, periodically, no matter how long our relationship has lasted, and how efficient we can be, via Zoom or Slack.
Yeah, totally. And look, I think one of the most interesting questions that we all face is, if you assume that this is a adoption cycle like any other adoption cycle, where there will be early adopters and laggards and other folks that learn over time, the number of people, the sheer number of employees at all levels, early, mid, senior, that are going through this and learning best practices and experimenting, the combination of that and technology, it feels like probably should lead to very different ways of thinking about how to do this. What is the right balance? Yeah. What starts to emerge over the coming years? I think it's easy to forget how early we are, in terms of what's a pretty formative change in the way that we think about our relationship.
I mean, look, it makes my job easy in the sense of like, homebrew is a small thing. We don't have to, we have an office, but we don't go into it most days, all the entire team. But I've also decided that part of the implication is that I need to travel more, as opposed to assuming that like, oh yeah, every company, the founders come out to the Bay Area, 4 times a year to meet with investors, or I can get a sense of the vibes for that company just by like walking around their office. That like, I need to go to where the founders are. I need to go to where, if they want me to come speak at an offsite, I will go to the offsite. That part of it is that management in the company itself / cap table, people who have a stake in that company, can make those decisions because it's probably right for the company or right for the broader team. But then we should also be willing to take on some of the responsibility for going to them versus trying to always call them to us.
Yep, I think that's well put. Maybe one last question to wrap this up, and then we'll do a couple other things. But the last thing I was curious about is, we have a number of listeners of different types of varieties. Some are chief people officers, some are real estate execs. A bunch of them are founders, though, early stage tech practitioners in some way. If you had to summarize from what you've seen across teams that have done this well or haven't done this well, the companies that you feel like are being more or less successful, are there any kind of like key takeaways or best practices that we haven't touched on so far that you think are important for folks to be thinking about in this area?
Yeah, well, so I think it's, if you haven't worked together before, closely as co-founders or as an early team, I do think it's worth finding the chance to do that early in your life cycle. I think it does solve a good, strong foundation. And it's not about just sort of making it, locking yourself in a conference room and coding away. And it's also not on the flip side, just like getting an Airbnb and cooking for one another. It's like a mixture of both. And so I would sort of front load a little bit of personal time together and working time together, knowing that it is easier to then switch into and compare a remote, a distributed, an employee choice to what it felt like all being together than it is to try to, move to that later on to solve a problem, or, because, once you raise enough money, you can do a proper offsite or that type of stuff. It's the same way, it's no different than sometimes when I used to work with teams, and, engineers hate going, people in general hate going date driven, engineers especially, like the idea of like, oh, this has to ship by a certain date, especially when those dates are artificial and made up. But I'm like, look, there's going to be at some point, if we are successful, at some point in the next, some period of time, there's going to be wow, we have to hit this date because that's when the new iPhone comes out, and like, this is a great opportunity, or this or that. So like, do you want the first time we try to be date driven, like when it actually matters, or should we practice once, And so obviously you practice once, type of thing. And so it's the same sort of thing. I think that like, you don't have to buy into the cult of either and never touch, the other alternative. Like, practice a little bit, so then you understand what it feels like and what some things are better at versus others. And so that would be my, advice for, founders who, in the first 6 to 12 months of your company, experiment a little bit, then decide, or, whatever you've decided, play with the other, so that you have some of that skill and ability, and what it feels like, so you can use it as a tool in your toolbox rather than getting drawn into the sort of I can't even say Twitter sphere, the X sphere of debate around which of these working styles is best.
Yeah, I love that, by the way. And in some ways, I would almost distill it down. And this probably isn't quite as rich as the way you described it, but it's, you don't want to go into the war room for the first time when you're at war. It's like, give yourself some reps at what it means to kind of like collaborate in that way, in that type of, whether it be intensity or co-located kind of way, and learn and understand what works for you or not,
Exactly.
So Hunter, I really appreciate it. Every conversation that we do on Flex Perspectives, we always end with rapid fire. That's more just about you, so people can get to know you a little bit more as a person. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a few, all 10 seconds or less, quick answers.
Let's do it. Ready to go.
All right. What was your very first job?
I worked in a children's bookstore. It was great. Sell books to parents. And
what did you do at the bookstore?
I was like a retail worker. Like,
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was great. I love, like, parents, think their kids want one book, and then you go and sit with the kid and actually talk to them, and you find out what they really like. It's so much fun. I love it. I have a great appreciation for kids and the way they learn and think. It's fantastic.
I love that, especially because my almost 2-year-old, her favorite thing is to go to story time at the library right now. So that is awesome. What is, in similar theme, what is the best book you've read lately?
Oh, best book I read lately. Well, Richard Rhodes' Making of the Atomic Bomb, I read last summer. And of course, now we've got the Oppenheimer movie, that came out this year. And that's just still stands out top of mind for so many reasons. I was a history major in undergrad. And so I love like picking a period of time or a particular event and just going deep on, make you feel like you were in the room for the decisions and that sort of stuff.
That's awesome. By the way, I'm very excited to see Oppenheimer. Peaky Blinders is one of my favorite TV shows, and so that cast is very exciting to me. When you are in meetings that are video conference meetings, are you typically camera on or camera off?
I am camera on, especially if it is a sort of smaller group. The only time I will go camera off, other than the preference of other people, sort of requesting it, is in larger group meetings, where I feel like, the faces are all kind of distracting if you're not, a speaker type of stuff, and they're not using, sort of the host mode. Or if I have to, leave the room or step up for a moment or something like that, I find like, looking at people's torsos is less exciting. And so I'll try to turn the camera off for that. But otherwise, sort of camera on and every once in a while showing you both of my hands so that you can see I'm not multitasking.
That's pretty good. And, it's funny because one of the things on camera I find I'm constantly doing is, where the camera is versus where someone's eyes are. Like you really can't tell the same way as in a room.
I try to be I try to be self-view off because I don't like looking at myself. I do find that distracting.
It's funny. I've been doing that increasingly recently also because I do find it distracting too. Yeah. Show or movie that you are obsessed with right now?
Oh, obsessed with. That's a strong. So I just finished watching. I'm a slow binger. Like I watch things late and far after they came off. I recently finished Andor, the Star Wars series. Okay, so I'm not a huge science fiction guy, and what I love about it is two things. One, you don't have to know 7 levels of depth into the Star Wars legend in order to appreciate it. Like maybe there's a bunch of Easter eggs, that type of stuff. But as somebody who's like only seen 75% of the movies, obviously all the classic ones, like. I felt like I could follow it. The second thing is it's sort of just a workplace drama. Like, people are like, oh, what happened with this and that and so forth. I'm like, I don't know. It's sort of more just like, a little bit of a family drama and workplace drama that just happens to have like a Star Wars motif about it. I love it's like a procedural. And I like stuff like that, getting to the depths of like, how the Empire, like some of the people in the Empire are very capable. And you find yourself sort of thinking like, oh yeah, they were competent Nazis too, like type of thing of like so I like the confusion of you find yourself sort of like being impressed by people who's ultimately are working for motives and goals that like are abhorrent.
It's funny that you say that because that was actually one of my biggest takeaways too from watching was, a lot of and I have to admit, I am a bit of a Star Wars nerd. So I've watched a bunch of stuff and it's, a lot of the older interpretations, it just feels like this very black and white kind of like difference between, one side and the other. And you'd only get so much depth in terms of what's going on in the Empire. This is almost like the Empire running like a really efficient, brutal corporation where people are like highly talented and executives in the kind of like the palace intrigue. And it kind of,
that's like Amazon. It's like Amazon or Microsoft.
Totally, right? Yeah. And so it kind of felt, they probably wouldn't appreciate that very much, but it's like that kind of had that feel where it's like, oh wait, this is kind of what happens after the event in a way that I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Favorite, 2 more for you. What is your favorite piece of software, either related to future of work, AI, flexible work that you're using or interested in right now?
God, I know it's so uncool to admit. I think email's freaking fantastic. In a world where there's like still so many siloed pieces of information and like proprietary protocols, like the fact that email just works is great. I use Superhuman. It may be very productive. I don't automate anything, but I do have a bunch of like templates that I'll use and customize and stuff because I do like to reply to people, even if I don't. I try to reply to every cold email at least once type of stuff, and it helps me do those things. So, shout out to email. Also, I found myself, especially during like peak remote, using things like Loom and just video in general, asynchronous video. So what I found myself is like, I didn't want to take a bunch of meetings. I was getting Zoom fatigue, so on and so forth. But sometimes people would have questions for me that I could answer async. And I'd say, okay, just send over your question. And then I'd see it and I'd be like, I don't want to, this is going to be 20 minutes to type a response, but 3 minutes to record one. And so I just started quick hitting on a bunch of like, when people ask me questions, replying with a, 30-second to 5-minute video. And it's great. Like I don't, I use Loom in particular for it. I probably, pay for 100% of the features and use 5% of the features. But I'm all into async video responses now.
Yeah, totally. Super helpful and so much richer, much more context. Sometimes it comes through that way.
I get to gesticulate a little. I'm an East Coast Jew. I get to just gesticulate a little bit. I get to meander. I get to like put some inflection and pause, even if it's totally stagecraft.
Yeah, well understood and appreciated from another East Coast Jew, so I totally get it. And then one last one for you. For anybody who's listening, who's interested in some of the things you had to say, wants to read more about you or learn more about HomeBrew, where should they go? hunterwalk.com. My dry piece of land on the internet. I've been blogging for like longer than I know you, probably since the early mid 2000s. And so that's probably the only, you can find Hunter Walk on most social spaces, but like hunterwalk.com is the place that I care about most. And then homebrew.co. But if you go to hunterwalk.com and
keep that top of mind, you'll be able to find everything else.
Awesome. Hunter, always a pleasure to catch up. It's been crazy that we know each other for 9 years now, and I love that story. And I find you incredibly thoughtful on so many topics related to startups. So I really appreciate you spending the time with me.
Oh, thanks so much. Obviously, the respect and friendship is all mutual. I appreciate, you're one of the people when I say, how can I help? You actually have a few ideas, and I try my best to make you happy.
Oh, well, thank you. All right. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.